This narrative is based on investigative reporting using real structural dynamics and documented patterns of organized crime and federal cooperation agreements in the United States. Certain names, identifying details, and locations have been altered. Some individuals are composites. The core architecture of the investigation reflects documented realities of how cooperation agreements, witness identity management, and financial obscuration have operated within the American justice system. The call came at 2:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been lying awake anyway, staring at the water stain on the ceiling of my apartment in Philadelphia, listening to the radiator knock and hiss the way it always did in February. My phone lit up the room. Unknown number, Chicago area code. I almost didn't answer. I wish, sometimes, that I hadn't. But I did answer, and the voice on the other end was so quiet I had to press the phone hard against my ear until it hurt. "You're the one who wrote about Salerno," the voice said. Not a question, a statement. "Yes," I said. "Then you need to know something. The man you wrote about, he's not dead. He never was." The line went dead. I sat up in bed. I put my feet on the cold floor. I turned on the lamp and I looked around my apartment at the stacks of files, the notebooks, the folders full of court documents I'd been living inside for the better part of 3 years, and I understood, in a way that settled into my chest like cold water, that whatever I thought I'd uncovered, I had only found the edge of something much larger and much darker than anything I'd been prepared to find. My name is Sarah Kessler. I'm an investigative journalist. I spent 11 years working for a mid-size newspaper in Philadelphia before I went independent. I've covered corruption, I've covered drug trafficking, I've covered the slow systematic erosion of public trust in institutions that were supposed to protect ordinary people. I thought I was used to it. I thought I had developed the skin for it. I had not. Nothing prepares you for the moment you realize that the story you're telling is also the story that could get you killed. This is what I found. This is what happened. And if you're hearing this, it means I decided the truth was worth more than the silence they offered me. I hope I was right. It started, the way many things do, with something small. An obituary. In March of 2019, I was doing what independent journalists do when the freelance work dries up. I was reading. Obsessively, systematically, scanning court records and local newspapers from cities I'd never been to, looking for threads. I had a Google alert set for names connected to organized crime cases I'd tracked over the years, a habit left over from my staff days when my editor used to call it feeding the beast. The beast, in my case, was a particular appetite for the intersection of institutional corruption and organized crime. I was interested in the places where the mob and legitimate power shook hands in the dark. The obituary ran in a small suburban paper out of Cook County, Illinois. The deceased was one Francis Anthony Salerno, age 61, described as a beloved husband, father of 3, and retired contractor. He had died, the obituary said, of heart failure at his home in Elmwood Park, a suburb west of Chicago that anyone who knows anything about the history of the Chicago outfit will recognize immediately. Elmwood Park was, for decades, a neighborhood where certain kinds of men lived quiet. Respectable lives in ranch houses with manicured lawns, while running operations that moved millions of dollars through legitimate businesses, through restaurants and construction companies and waste management firms and vending machine routes that stretched across 6 states. I wouldn't have looked twice at Frank Salerno's obituary except for one thing. His name appeared in a 1997 FBI affidavit I had in a folder on my hard drive, an affidavit related to a money laundering investigation that had eventually led nowhere. The case quietly closed in 2001, the files partially sealed. In that affidavit, Frank Salerno was described as a known associate of a man named Raymond Cassio, who was himself described as a mid-level figure in what remained of the Chicago outfit's financial infrastructure in the late 1990s. Cassio had died in 2003, officially of a stroke. 2 of the other men named in that affidavit had also died in the years following. One had gone to prison and been released. One had cooperated with federal investigators and disappeared into the Witness Protection Program. And now Frank Salerno was dead too. Died quietly, heart failure, survived by his wife, Donna, and his 3 children, Michael, Angela, and Thomas. I would have let it go. I should have let it go. But something about the obituary bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate immediately, a wrongness at the edge of my vision, like a word that refuses to resolve into meaning. I printed it out. I put it in a folder. I went to bed and dreamed about something else entirely. It wasn't until 2 days later, while I was going through a separate set of documents related to an unrelated case, that the thing that had been bothering me surfaced. The obituary listed Frank Salerno's survivors, and among them was his son, Thomas Salerno, described as a resident of Tampa, Florida. And I had, in a completely different folder, a court document from a 2016 civil asset forfeiture case in Hillsborough County, Florida, a case involving a company called Clearwater Contracting Solutions, and among the principals listed in that case was a Thomas A. Salerno, address, Tampa. It could have been a coincidence. The name Thomas Salerno is not uncommon, but I am a journalist, and when I find 2 threads that appear to connect, my instinct is not to assume coincidence. My instinct is to pull. So I pulled. What I found over the next 3 weeks changed everything I thought I understood about what happened in Chicago in the 1990s, about how the federal government handles its sources, about the limits of immunity agreements, and about what men will do, what institutions will do, to protect a secret that has already cost too much to be told. I drove to Chicago in April of 2019. I rented a car at O'Hare and drove west on I-90 with the windows cracked because it was the first genuinely warm day of the year and I have a superstition about fresh air at the beginning of something important. I had a notebook, I had a recorder, I had a folder of printed documents on the passenger seat. I had no idea what I was walking into. Elmwood Park in Spring is the kind of suburb that makes you understand why people chose it. Wide streets, mature trees just beginning to go green, bungalows and ranch houses set back from the sidewalk with hedges trimmed to military precision. There is a particular kind of Midwestern respectability on display in neighborhoods like this, a studied ordinariness that functions, for people who understand its history, as its own kind of statement. This is a neighborhood where you don't ask questions, where the man next door runs a vending machine route and drives a Cadillac and coaches his son's little league team, and you understand, without ever being told, that you don't ask where the money comes from. The house where Frank Salerno had lived was a brick ranch on a corner lot, not particularly large, not particularly distinguished. There was a for sale sign in the yard. The yard itself was immaculate, the early spring garden already attended to. I sat in my rental car across the street for a few minutes, not entirely sure what I expected to find by looking at a house. Sometimes you need to physically inhabit a location to understand the texture of a story. Sometimes you need to stand in the geography of the events to feel them properly. After a while I drove to the Cook County Recorder of Deeds office in downtown Chicago. Property records are public. This is one of the fundamental, underappreciated truths of investigative journalism. An enormous amount of information is technically available to anyone who knows how to look for it and is patient enough to do the looking. The deed to the property on Elmwood Park's Nicolai Avenue was held in the name of Donna Salerno. The property had been purchased in 1988 for $187,000. In the years since, it had been refinanced twice. Nothing unusual, but there was a second property that came up when I searched Donna Salerno's name, a property not in Illinois, but in Florida. Specifically, in Sarasota County. A condominium purchased in 2011 for $340,000, paid in cash, held in the name of Donna T. Salerno. Sarasota County. That was interesting, because Sarasota County was not Tampa, but it wasn't far from Tampa either. And Thomas Salerno, Frank's son, was listed as a Tampa resident. I called the source I had in the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, a contact I'd cultivated over years of covering real estate fraud stories, and I asked her to run a search on Clearwater Contracting Solutions, the company from the 2016 civil forfeiture case. She called me back the next day. Clearwater Contracting Solutions had been licensed in Florida since 2009. Its registered agent was a man named Robert DeLuca. Its principal officer was listed as Thomas A. Salerno. The company had been the subject of that 2016 civil asset forfeiture action, which had alleged that funds flowing through the company's accounts were proceeds of unlawful activity. The action had been resolved, not through prosecution, but through settlement. The company had paid a fine of $85,000 and the case had been closed. No criminal charges, no admission of wrongdoing, $85,000 to close a money laundering investigation. For context, in 2016, Clearwater Contracting Solutions had reported gross revenues of just under $4.2 million. I drove back to Philadelphia that night thinking about the mathematics of impunity. I want to tell you about a woman I'll call Catherine, because that is not her name and she asked me never to use her real name. I don't blame her. If I were in her position, I would have asked for the same thing. I found Catherine through a chain of connections so circuitous that I couldn't even fully reconstruct it now. What I can tell you is that she had attended Frank Salerno's funeral in March of 2019. She had known Frank Salerno for most of her adult life, had known him through his wife, Donna, who was a childhood friend of Catherine's mother. She told me later that she had stood at the graveside and watched the coffin being lowered into the ground and felt, the entire time, something she could only describe as uncanny. A feeling that something was wrong with the scene she was watching. The wife wasn't crying, Catherine told me. We were sitting in a diner in Oak Park, a few miles from Elmwood Park. It was early June by then, and I'd driven back to Chicago specifically to meet her. Donna she's always been an emotional woman. She cried at her daughter's wedding for 3 hours. She cried at her dog's funeral. But at Frank's graveside, she wasn't crying. She was calm. She was composed. And I thought at the time, well, maybe she's holding it together for the kids. Maybe she's in shock. But there was something else. Catherine wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. She was a woman in her early 60s, composed, precise in her speech, with eyes that had the particular quality I've noticed in people who have spent a long time watching things they're not supposed to talk about. The priest didn't say his name, she said. At the graveside, he said, "Our brother Francis's and this beloved man." But he never said his name. And at the time I thought maybe that was just how this priest did things. But afterward, when I was thinking about it, she paused. I asked Donna about it. I asked her how she was coping. And she said, "He's at peace, Kathy. He's finally at peace." And the way she said it, the way she emphasized finally, it didn't sound like grief. It sounded like relief. I asked Catherine if she would be willing to tell me anything else she remembered from that day. She thought for a moment, and then she said something that I've turned over in my mind many times since. "There was a man at the back of the church," she said. I didn't recognize him, which was unusual. It was a small service, mostly family and old neighbors. He was younger than most of us, maybe 40, well-dressed. He didn't come to the graveside. He left right after the service. But he and Donna made eye contact when she was walking out of the church. And she gave him the smallest nod, like they knew each other, like something had been confirmed. I asked her if she could describe him. Average height, dark hair, going gray at the temples. Italian-looking, I suppose, but I know that's not a useful description in that community. She smiled thinly. He had a particular kind of stillness. The way some people have who are used to being in rooms without calling attention to themselves. A man who knew how to disappear into a room. That description would come back to me 6 months later in a way that made my hands shake. There is a man I'm going to call Delaney, not his real name. He spent 22 years working organized crime for the FBI's Chicago field office before retiring in 2012. He lives now in a small city in Indiana. He agreed to talk to me after I sent him a certified letter, an actual paper letter, because he had told a mutual contact that he didn't trust email and didn't own a smartphone. When I drove to meet him, he made me leave my phone in my car. We sat on his back porch. He served iced tea. He was in his late 60s, a big man gone soft in the middle but still carrying something in his posture that told you what he'd been. I can't talk on record about active investigations, he said. Is there an active investigation? I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. I said I can't talk about active investigations, which was itself an answer. Delaney had worked on the financial crimes side of OC investigations throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. He had been peripherally involved in the investigation that had produced the 1997 affidavit naming Frank Salerno. He told me, in careful, non-attributable terms, that Frank Salerno had been of significant interest to federal investigators for approximately a decade. The outfit in the 90s wasn't what it had been, he said. You had the old guys dying, the traditional leadership structure in collapse. What was left was, it had restructured around money, around financial infrastructure. The guys who were valuable weren't the ones who could hurt people. They were the ones who could move money, who understood the system, who had relationships with lawyers and accountants and bankers who were willing to be flexible. I asked him about Raymond Cassio, the man named alongside Salerno in the 1997 affidavit. Delaney turned his glass of iced tea in his hands. Cassio was a facilitator, he said. A connector. He didn't make decisions. He made introductions. He knew who needed what and who could provide it. And Salerno? Salerno understood construction. He'd run legitimate crews his whole career. Had the licenses, had the relationships with unions and suppliers. The kind of man who could absorb money on one side and produce invoices on the other. I asked whether the 2001 closure of the investigation had been appropriate, given what the FBI knew. Delaney was quiet for a long moment. A bird sang somewhere in his yard. I'll say this, he said finally. I'll say that the closure of that investigation was a decision made above my pay grade. And I'll say that when decisions are made above your pay grade, sometimes you don't get a full explanation. And sometimes, years later, you understand why. Why did you understand why? I asked. He looked at me steadily. Because you develop a sense, he said, for when someone has already been spoken to. When someone has already made a deal. He wouldn't say anything more specific. But as I was leaving, he stopped me at the door and said, without preamble, be careful who you tell what you've found. There are people on both sides of this who have reasons to want it to stay quiet. Both sides. I drove back to Philadelphia thinking about what that meant. The mob, and the government. Let me explain something about how federal cooperation agreements work, because understanding the mechanics is essential to understanding what I believe happened to Frank Salerno. When a federal prosecutor wants to flip a witness, wants to turn someone inside a criminal organization into a source of information and, ultimately, courtroom testimony, they offer something in exchange. The exchange is usually some combination of reduced charges, reduced sentencing, and, in the most extreme cases, relocation and new identity through the Justice Department's Witness Security Program, which most people call WITSEC. The program is administered by the U.S. Marshals Service, and it has existed in its current form since 1971. It has relocated approximately 19,000 witnesses and family members since its inception. Here is what most people don't know about WITSEC. There is a category of participation that falls short of full relocation and new identity. It is not widely discussed in public documents. It involves agreements in which a witness provides information, sometimes over years, without ever appearing in court, without ever being officially named as a cooperator. Their cooperation is protected not through relocation but through management. Through careful control of what is known and what is not known. Through the maintenance of a fiction. I am describing what some prosecutors and defense attorneys have called, informally, deep background cooperation. I have spoken to 3 former federal prosecutors who confirmed that such arrangements exist. 2 of them declined to say anything further. The third, a woman who had spent 20 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of Illinois before going into private practice, told me something that I've turned over many times since. The problem with those arrangements, she said, is that they create a class of people who are permanently protected. Permanently insulated, not because they're innocent, they're not innocent, but because they've made themselves too valuable to expose. They know too much about too many things. Exposing them means exposing the cooperation, which means exposing investigations, which means potentially unwinding years of work. She paused. And sometimes it means something else. Sometimes it means exposing the fact that the government looked the other way while the cooperator continued to operate. Because sometimes that's the deal. Sometimes the deal is, you keep doing what you're doing, you just tell us about the people around you. I asked her if that was legal. Legal is a complicated word, she said. In late July of 2019, I flew to Tampa. I had by this point established several things that I was reasonably confident in, though reasonably confident in journalism is a provisional state, always subject to revision. I was confident that Frank Salerno had been of significant interest to federal investigators and that the investigation had been closed under unusual circumstances. I was confident that his son Thomas operated a Florida construction company that had been the subject of a civil asset forfeiture action resolved with suspicious ease. I was confident that a condominium in Sarasota County was registered in Donna Salerno's name. And I was nursing, carefully, the hypothesis that Frank Salerno's death might not have been what his obituary claimed it was. The hypothesis felt wild when I stated it plainly. But journalism is full of hypotheses that sound wild until they don't. Thomas Salerno's business, Clearwater Contracting Solutions, operated out of a suite of offices in a nondescript building in the New Tampa area, north of the city. I didn't try to contact Thomas Salerno directly, not yet. I wasn't ready to make that move. What I wanted first was texture, context. I wanted to understand the operational environment before I announced my presence in it. I spent 4 days in Tampa. I talked to people in the construction industry, framing my inquiries as background research for a general piece about Florida's building boom and the use of subcontractors. I talked to a commercial real estate agent. I talked to a woman who worked for the county building permits office and who was, bless her, a talker. I drank a lot of coffee in diners and hotel lobbies and listened. What I learned was that Clearwater Contracting Solutions was well regarded in its niche, mid-sized commercial projects. Renovations, fit-outs for office buildings. Nobody seemed to know it was anything other than what it appeared to be. Thomas Salerno was described to me as professional, not particularly sociable, diligent. He had a reputation for delivering on budget and on schedule. On my 3rd day in Tampa, I drove to Sarasota. The condominium registered in Donna Salerno's name was in a development near the bay. A well-maintained complex, not ostentatious, the kind of place that upper-middle-class retirees from the Midwest choose when they want winters without ice. I had no plan beyond seeing the place, understanding the geography. I sat in my car in the parking lot and looked at the building and thought about what Catherine had told me, about Donna's composure at the graveside, about the word finally. And then the door of Unit 114 opened, and a man walked out. He was in his early 60s. Gray hair, medium height, he wore a short-sleeved linen shirt and carried a bag of groceries. He walked to a silver Lexus sedan in the parking lot, put the groceries in the trunk, and stood for a moment with his face turned toward the bay. The afternoon light was sharp and clear. I could see him perfectly. I did not recognize him, but I took photographs with my telephoto lens, and I wrote down the license plate number of the silver Lexus. I drove back to my hotel room in Tampa, opened my laptop, and sent the license plate number to a source in Florida law enforcement whom I'd used before for legitimate background checks. She called me back inside an hour. The plate comes back to a Robert Fontaine, she said. Address listed is the same complex you described. Sarasota. He's clean. No priors, no warrants. Robert Fontaine, I repeated. Yeah, the car was purchased new in 2017. Title transferred from a leasing company. Original lease registered to a company called Meridian Property Consultants LLC, out of Delaware. Delaware LLC, the classic structure of financial opacity. I thanked her and hung up. Robert Fontaine. I ran the name through every database I had access to. I found a thin digital footprint, a LinkedIn profile, largely empty, listing him as a real estate consultant. A property record for the Sarasota condo, purchased in 2011 in conjunction with Donna Salerno. The condo was jointly titled. I found nothing else. No social media, no news mentions, no court records. A man with almost no history. A man who had materialized in the public record in 2009, when Meridian Property Consultants was registered in Delaware, and whose existence before that date was, as far as I could determine, essentially blank. I know what you're thinking. Because I was thinking it too. I went back through my photographs from the parking lot. I looked at the man's face. And then I opened my folder of archival documents and found a photograph I had. A scan of a newspaper photograph from the Chicago Tribune, dated 1994, showing a group of men leaving a courthouse following a hearing in an unrelated racketeering case. One of the men in the photograph, identified by the Tribune's caption, was Francis Anthony Salerno. I put the two images side by side on my screen. The courthouse photograph was 25 years old. The man in it was younger, 47 in the morning in February. He's not dead. He never was. I need to go back to the phone call. Because by August of 2019 I had become preoccupied with the question of who had called me and why, and the answer, when I found it, was as disturbing as anything else I uncovered. The call had come from a Chicago area code. Unknown number. The voice had been male, probably middle-aged based on timbre, speaking in a low, careful tone. The call had lasted 11 seconds. I'd tried to call back immediately and gotten a disconnected signal, which suggested a prepaid or VoIP line. I went back through my published work to think about who might have read my piece on Salerno, a shorter, earlier piece I'd published in 2018 in an online legal affairs publication, focused primarily on the 1997 affidavit and the pattern of closed investigations in Chicago. It hadn't attracted significant readership. 1,200 views, 40 social media shares, a few comments, but someone had read it who knew something real. Someone who had decided, for their own reasons, that I should know Frank Salerno was still alive. That meant either someone who opposed Salerno and wanted his secret exposed, or someone who was warning me, pointing me toward a story while perhaps underestimating how far I'd pursue it. I thought about Delaney, the retired FBI agent, and his careful statement that there are people on both sides of this who wanted it quiet. I thought about the civil asset forfeiture case in Florida that had been resolved with suspicious ease. And I began to develop a theory about the call that I found deeply unsettling. What if the person who called me was someone within the federal system, not a whistleblower in the conventional sense, but someone who had become uncomfortable with the arrangement? Someone who knew about the deal, knew about the fiction, and had decided to introduce a journalist into the situation without leaving any fingerprints. If the arrangement I was hypothesizing about, a long-term, deep background cooperation deal, was real, it would require ongoing maintenance. It would require people within the U.S. Marshals Service, or the U.S. Attorney's Office, or the FBI, who knew the truth and had agreed to protect it. Those people would age, they would retire, they would develop consciences, or resentments, or both. And occasionally, one of them might decide to make an 11-second phone call to an investigative journalist from a prepaid phone. I have never been able to confirm this theory. It remains a theory, but I've never found a better explanation. In September of 2019, I received a package in the mail. No return address, Chicago postmark. Inside, a manila envelope containing a single document, 8 pages, photocopied. The document appeared to be a memorandum, not on official letterhead, but formatted in the style of federal government internal communications. It was dated June 2001. It referenced, in careful bureaucratic language, a source development agreement between the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois and a confidential human source designated C-4417. I want to be precise about what the document said and what it didn't say. It did not name C-4417. It described, in general terms, an arrangement in which C-4417 would provide ongoing intelligence regarding financial operations and personnel within what it called the organization, the outfit, clearly, though the word is never used, in exchange for certain considerations including non-prosecution on specified past activities, assistance with lifestyle transition, and an ongoing stipend described as a source maintenance payment of $4,500 per month. $4,500 per month, paid, presumably, from the beginning of 2001. The document described a term of 5 years, with renewal provisions. It had, in the spot where signatures would appear, only initials. On the government side, 2 sets of initials I couldn't identify. On the other side, in different ink, slightly uneven, as if written carefully by someone not accustomed to signing documents in this way, FAS. Francis Anthony Salerno. I sat with that document for 3 days before I told anyone I had it. I didn't sleep much during those 3 days. I went through it line by line with a legal pad next to me, noting every word, every phrase, every ambiguity. I consulted a former federal prosecutor I trusted, not on the record, simply as a sounding board, who told me that if the document was genuine, it represented an extraordinary arrangement, and that the ongoing nature of the stipend payments would create a paper trail that should, theoretically, be traceable. I asked her if she thought it was genuine. She was quiet for a moment. The language is right, she said. The format is right. The level of vagueness is very right. These documents are always vague, deliberately. The reference to lifestyle transition is a real term of art. Another pause. I don't know how you'd fabricate it convincingly enough to fool someone who'd spent time in those offices. But I also can't rule it out. I asked her if it mattered, whether it was genuine, given everything else I'd found. It matters enormously, she said, if you're going to publish. In October of 2019, I made my first overt move. I contacted Thomas Salerno. I sent a letter to the offices of Clearwater Contracting Solutions in Tampa. I identified myself as an investigative journalist. I said I was working on a story related to the history of his family's business interests in both Illinois and Florida, and that I would welcome the opportunity to speak with him. I gave my phone number and email address. He didn't call, he didn't email, his attorney did. The attorney's name was Gerald Mira, a partner at a firm in Tampa with offices also in Chicago. I recognized the firm's name from a document I'd encountered months earlier, a filing in the 2016 civil asset forfeiture case. The firm had represented Clearwater Contracting Solutions in that proceeding. Attorney Mira's communication to me was a letter, again, an actual paper letter, which I found suggestive, informing me that his client had no comment on any matters relating to his family, his business, or any allegations or insinuations of wrongdoing. It further informed me that his client would vigorously pursue all available legal remedies in response to any publication of false, misleading, or defamatory statements. A boilerplate threat letter. I'd received versions of it before. But what struck me was the speed of the response, less than 72 hours from my mailing, which meant Thomas Salerno had moved immediately, which meant I had made contact with a nerve. I sent a follow-up letter to Attorney Mira listing the specific documents I had and the specific questions I wanted to give his client the opportunity to address. I gave him 2 weeks. 2 days after that letter was sent, a man appeared outside my apartment building in Philadelphia. I noticed him because I notice things. It's an occupational habit, maybe an occupational pathology. He was parked across the street in a dark blue Honda Accord, and he was there when I left in the morning and there when I came back in the evening, and the following morning he was there again. The third morning I walked directly to the car and knocked on the window. He looked at me without expression. He was in his 40s, heavy-set, crew-cut, and then he started the car and drove away. He didn't come back, but knowing he had been there changed something in how I moved through the world. I started taking different routes. I paid more attention to the cars behind me on the highway. I backed up every document I had to 3 separate cloud services and to a physical drive that I kept in a safe deposit box at a bank 2 miles from my apartment. My sister called me during this period and asked how I was doing, and I said I was fine, and she said I didn't sound fine, and I said work was complicated, and she said I always said that, and she was right. The thing about a story like this is that it doesn't stay still while you're telling it. It grows. It develops new dimensions. You pull a thread and the fabric of the thing shifts in ways you didn't anticipate. In November of 2019, 8 months after I first noticed Frank Salerno's obituary, I made a discovery that reoriented everything I thought I'd understood. I was reviewing court records in Cook County, a tedious process, physical records in a basement room that smelled of old paper and institutional cleaning products, when I found a document that had no immediate bearing on anything I was investigating but that contained a reference I couldn't ignore. The document was a 2017 civil lawsuit, a dispute over a commercial property in the Wicker Park neighborhood of Chicago. One of the parties was a property management company. The lawsuit referenced an earlier transaction, a 2009 property transfer, and listed as a party to that transfer a company called Delta Meridian Holdings. Delta Meridian Holdings. Meridian, the name of the Delaware LLC connected to Robert Fontaine's Lexus in Sarasota. It could have been a coincidence. The word, meridian, is not uncommon in business names. But I had learned, by this point, not to believe in coincidences. I filed a records request for information on Delta Meridian Holdings. Delta Meridian Holdings was incorporated in Nevada in 2008, another opacity-friendly state. Its registered agent was a company that served as a professional registered agent for dozens of entities, telling me nothing. Its listed manager was a woman named Patricia Greco. I found Patricia Greco in the Social Security Death Index. She had died in 2004, which meant Delta Meridian Holdings, incorporated in 2008, listed as its manager a woman who had been dead for 4 years. The use of deceased individuals as nominal principals of shell companies is a known method of financial obscuration. It is not subtle, and it is not legal. But it is, in practice, surprisingly common and surprisingly difficult to prosecute without dedicated investigative resources. I went looking for Raymond Cassio. Raymond Cassio had died in 2003, according to a Cook County death certificate I obtained. Heart attack. He had been 63. He had been buried in a Catholic cemetery in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. His obituary, in the Tribune, was longer and more affectionate than Frank Salerno's. Cassio had apparently been a figure of some community prominence. Involved in charitable organizations, a past president of his local Knights of Columbus chapter. He was survived by his wife, Rosemary, and 4 children. His wife Rosemary was still alive. She still lived, according to county records, in the house they had shared in Harwood Heights. I drove back to Chicago in December of 2019. The city was cold and gray and magnificent in its bleakness, the lake producing an iron-colored light that pressed against everything. I sat outside Rosemary Cassio's house for a long time before I went to the door. I wasn't sure what I expected her to tell me. I wasn't sure what I was going to ask. She was a small, precise woman in her mid-70s who answered the door with her coat on and a grocery list in her hand. She looked at me with sharp, cautious eyes when I introduced myself and explained what I was working on. "I don't talk about my husband's former business," she said. Her voice was even, careful. "I'm not here to talk about his former business," I said. "I'm here because I think I've found something that affects your family." That was a calculated thing to say, and I felt the calculation in it, and I'm not proud of it. But it worked. She studied me for another moment, and then she stepped back from the door. We sat at her kitchen table and she made coffee and she listened while I explained, in broad terms, what I had found and what I suspected. I didn't show her the documents. I didn't name names I wasn't ready to name. I watched her face. Her face did not change the way the face of someone hearing surprising information changes. It remained composed, still, the stillness of someone hearing confirmation of something they've long suspected rather than something new. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "My husband was not a saint," she said finally. "I knew that. I made my peace with it. But there was a period, toward the end, the last few years before he died, when something changed. He was different. He was careful in ways he hadn't been before. He was quieter, like he was listening for something. She wrapped her hands around her cup. He told me once, this is maybe 2 years before he died, he said, "Rosie, whatever happens, the house is yours and it's clean." And I didn't ask him what he meant. Because sometimes with Raymond, you didn't ask. I asked her whether she had ever had any indication that her husband's death might not have been what it appeared. She was quiet for a very long time. "My son went to the funeral home," she said, "to identify the body. Raymond and we'd agreed years before that I wouldn't have to see him that way. My son Carlo went, and afterward he was different. Shaken, I thought, but when I asked him how his father had looked, he said, 'Fine, Mom.' He looked fine, and I believed him, but Carlo doesn't talk about it. In 20 years, Carlo has never mentioned seeing his father in that funeral home. Not once." I thanked her. I drove back to my hotel and sat on the bed and stared at the wall for a long time. 2 men, both dead, both connected through the 1997 affidavit, both with family members in Florida, both with business interests running through anonymous LLCs, both leaving behind widows who answered questions with a stillness that was not the stillness of grief. 2 cooperating witnesses, 2 fictions, 1 architecture. By February of 2020, I had been working on this story for almost a year. I had a draft of 12,000 words. I had documents. I had sources, on and off the record. I had the photograph comparison. I had the trail of LLCs. I had Delaney's careful non-attributable statements. I had the document with the initials FAS. I had the testimony of 2 women who had stood at gravesides and felt that something was wrong. What I didn't have was a living person, on record, willing to say any of this was true. And I had a question I couldn't stop sitting with. A question that was keeping me up at 3 in the morning with increasing regularity. Not 2:47, not with a phone call, just awake, staring at the ceiling, asking myself the same thing over and over. If I published what I had, what happened to Frank Salerno? And I want to be clear about why I was asking this question, because I don't want you to think I was asking it out of sympathy for the man. I was not. Frank Salerno had spent decades as a financial enabler of organized crime. He had helped move money for people who hurt people, who intimidated people, who corrupted public officials and poisoned communities. He was not a victim. But if the arrangement I'd uncovered was real, if there was a federal cooperation agreement, if there was an ongoing stipend, if there were people in the federal government who had agreed to maintain the fiction of his death, then publishing what I knew would expose him. Not just to public scrutiny, to the people he had cooperated against, to whoever remained of the organization whose inner workings he had been feeding to federal investigators for potentially 2 decades. The mob is not what it was in 1975. The outfit is not what it was in 1995. But it is not nothing. And men who cooperate against it and are exposed do not retire quietly. The history of organized crime in this country is full of their names, and their names are on gravestones, and some of those gravestones are real. I went back and forth on this for weeks. I talked to editors. I talked to media lawyers. I talked to a journalist I deeply respected who had covered organized crime for 30 years and who told me, bluntly, "You're not responsible for what happens to him. He made his choices. You do your job." I also talked to a source in the legal world who told me, equally bluntly, "If you publish this and he gets killed, you're going to have to live with that." I'm going to have to live with that. That sentence lived in me for a long time. In March of 2020, the pandemic arrived, and in the paralysis of those first weeks I made a decision I probably wouldn't have made under normal circumstances. I reached out, through an intermediary I will not name, to attorney Gerald Mira. I told Mira that I was nearly finished with the story. I told him that I was willing, before publication, to have a single conversation off the record, not an interview, not an opportunity for comment, just a conversation, with anyone he thought appropriate. I told him that this was not a negotiation. I told him I would publish regardless. But I was a journalist, and giving a subject the chance to address what I'd found before I published it was the right thing to do. Mira came back to me 2 days later with a counter. His client would not meet, but someone else would. The meeting happened on a Tuesday in late March of 2020, over a video call, this being the pandemic, with a man whose name I was given as David Holt. I don't believe that was his real name. He appeared to be in his 50s, gray suit, neutral background, the practiced blankness of someone who spent time on calls they would later deny having. He told me, without preamble, that he understood I had developed a theory about certain individuals and that this theory, while not entirely without basis, was based on incomplete information and that publication could have, and he used this phrase carefully, significant negative consequences for ongoing matters of national interest. I asked him what he meant by ongoing matters. He said he wasn't in a position to be specific. I asked him who he represented. He said he was an attorney representing parties whose identities he was not at liberty to disclose. I asked him whether those parties included the United States government. He paused, and then he said, "I'm not in a position to confirm or deny the involvement of any government agency in any matter you may be investigating." Which was, in the formal grammar of these conversations, a confirmation. I told him I would continue with publication. I asked if he had anything he wanted me to consider before I did. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I've thought about many times since. He said, "Ms. Kessler, I want you to consider the possibility that the people who put certain things in motion did so because the alternative was worse. And that the people protecting certain arrangements are protecting them not out of corruption but out of an assessment that the information those arrangements produce is more valuable than the story you want to tell." I said that I understood why someone might make that argument, but that it was not my job to accept it. He nodded, once. "I know," he said. "I just wanted you to have heard it." The call ended. I closed my laptop and went and stood at my window looking out at the empty Philadelphia street below, this being the first weeks of lockdown, when the whole country felt like it had stopped breathing, and I asked myself whether I believed him. Whether the arrangement was genuinely valuable, whether there was something worth protecting on the other side of the story I was about to tell. And here is the thing that I keep coming back to: I don't know. I genuinely don't know. There is a version of this story in which two criminals made deals with the federal government, provided information that disrupted operations and perhaps saved lives, and were allowed to live quietly because the alternative, exposing them, ending the cooperation, potentially triggering retaliatory violence, was worse than the fiction. There is a version in which the system, for once, bent its own rules toward something resembling a functional outcome. And there is another version in which two men who should have faced accountability were allowed to construct false deaths and live comfortable lives in Florida while the communities they helped victimize received nothing. In which federal officials made self-serving decisions and called them public interest. In which the fiction of justice was maintained while justice itself was quietly retired. I believe both versions are partially true. That is the hardest thing I know about this story. Let me be precise about what I have established versus what I believe versus what I can only suspect. I have established, through public records, that Francis Anthony Salerno was named in a 1997 FBI affidavit as a known associate of organized crime. I have established that an investigation related to that affidavit was closed in 2001 without charges. I have established that Donna Salerno owns property in Sarasota County, Florida. I have established that a man named Robert Fontaine has resided at that property and is co-titled on it. I have established that Robert Fontaine's vehicle was originally leased by Meridian Property Consultants LLC, a Delaware entity. I have established that the same Delaware entity appears connected, through naming convention, to Delta Meridian Holdings, which listed a deceased woman as its manager. I have established that Thomas Salerno operates a Florida construction company that was the subject of a civil asset forfeiture action resolved unusually favorably. I have a document that I believe to be genuine, and that my legal and journalistic consultants believe to be genuine, that describes a federal cooperation agreement with an individual identified by initials consistent with Francis Anthony Salerno's name. I believe, based on the convergence of this evidence and on the visual comparison of photographs, that the man living in the Sarasota condominium is Francis Anthony Salerno, who is not dead, and who has been living under the identity of Robert Fontaine pursuant to or in the vicinity of a federal cooperation arrangement. I believe, based on parallel evidence, that a similar arrangement may exist for Raymond Cassio, who is also officially dead. I cannot prove the latter belief. I do not have a document with Raymond Cassio's initials. I have the behavior of his widow, the silence of his son, and the circumstantial architecture of connected LLCs. That is suggestive but not conclusive. What I can say with complete confidence is this: the official account of Frank Salerno's death is false. A real person is living in Sarasota County under a different name. And the federal government knows. In August of 2020, 17 months after the phone call that started all of this, I received a second call from a Chicago area code. Different prepaid number, same measured, quiet voice. "Are you going to publish?" the voice asked. "Yes," I said. A pause. "Then you should know one more thing." Another pause, longer this time. "The arrangement you found, it didn't start in 2001. The document you have is the formalization. The relationship started in 1994. The reason the 1997 investigation went nowhere wasn't that the FBI missed things. It was that the FBI was already running him. The affidavit was cover. It was a way of putting his name in a public document to explain why the investigation existed, while ensuring the investigation would never go anywhere. I gripped the phone. "Who are you?" I asked. I'd asked before, the first time. I asked again. "Someone who was in rooms where decisions were made that I couldn't agree with," the voice said. "Someone who is old enough now that it doesn't matter what happens to me." "Will you go on record?" A long pause. "No." "Will you meet with me?" "No." "Can you at least tell me whether Raymond Cassio is also?" "Yes," the voice said. And then, before I could say anything else, "Be careful, Ms. Kessler. Not because they'll hurt you, they won't. But because once you publish, you'll be a part of this. You'll be in the story. And stories like this one don't end. They just get new chapters." The call lasted 43 seconds. The number, again, was disconnected. I published a version of this investigation in the fall of 2020. The version I published was more carefully hedged than what you've heard tonight. Names were handled differently. Certain details were altered to protect sources while preserving the essential truth of the account. The response was significant and, in many ways, instructive. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois declined to comment. The FBI declined to comment. Attorney Gerald Mira sent a letter threatening legal action, which did not materialize. A spokesperson for the Justice Department described the story as based on speculation and unverified documents. They did not say the documents were fabricated. They said, unverified. 3 journalists at major outlets subsequently contacted me to say they were pursuing follow-up investigations. One of them, a reporter at a national paper I respect enormously, told me 6 months later that he'd hit a wall, that sources he trusted had advised him, with notable urgency, to let the story go. He let the story go. The Sarasota condominium where I photographed the man I believe to be Frank Salerno was sold in December of 2020. The buyer was another Delaware LLC. The man I photographed has not been found at that address since. Robert Fontaine, if he ever existed as anything other than a legal convenience, has no current address in any public database I can find. Donna Salerno continues to live in Elmwood Park. The house was taken off the market and remains in her name. Thomas Salerno continues to operate Clearwater Contracting Solutions. The company's revenues have continued to grow. Carlo Cassio, Raymond's son, has never spoken to the press about his father. The voice on the phone has never called again. And I sit here, in the same apartment with the same water stain on the ceiling, still pulling threads from a fabric that doesn't want to unravel, still asking the same questions I was asking the morning after that first call. How many fictions are we living inside of? How many men with new names are driving silver Lexuses in Florida right now? Their cooperation purchased with someone else's silence? How many cases were closed not because justice was served but because the cost of serving it was judged too high by people sitting in rooms we'll never be invited into? I don't have answers. I have documents, and photographs, and the testimony of women who stood at gravesides and felt the wrongness of what they were watching, and the voice of a man who was in rooms where decisions were made and couldn't live with it all the way to his grave. That is not nothing. I have to believe it's not nothing. But some nights I think about what the man on the video call said to me. That the people maintaining the arrangement were doing so not out of corruption but out of a calculation that it was worth it. And I think about the calculation itself. Who makes it, who pays for it, who never gets to know it was made on their behalf. And I think about Frank Salerno eating dinner in a condo near the bay in Sarasota, watching the water, living inside the second life he negotiated for himself. And I think, there is no version of this story where justice is the word that fits. There is the truth, and there is what we're allowed to know. And somewhere in the distance between those two things, men with new names are living their lives. And the phone might ring again. Or it might not, and either way, I'll answer it.